Thank you. Good evening, welcome. So thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion. My name is Ping Ni. I'm the chair of the Future Wanxiang Foundation, and also have the honor of serving on the board here at Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The relationship between United States and China is one of the most complicated, controversial, and consequential in today's world. For U.S. business operating globally, and for Chinese company with significant investment here in the United States, although the fundamental business logic has not changed, China's extraordinary economic rise has caused some concerns, not only because China's growth will shift the global balance of power, but also such a shift will bring the national security and other strategic challenges. So the reality we are facing today is that although the world is getting smaller, the distance between the United States and China is getting much bigger. From soybean to rare earth minerals, from the TikTok to the Blackwell chips, conflict and the tension are at many fronts. So the two powers could play the chess as a rival, one being black, one being white, or the black and white could find a way to make a fit, like we saw what is on pandas. So the question in front of us today are significant. Confrontation or cooperation? Decoupling or de-risk? How would China use its growing power on the world stage, and how should the United States respond? Or how USA, China could work together to find a way to manage this competition and to peacefully coexist. So those are the questions driving the Chicago Council series on China and the world, of which this conversation is a part. So tonight, we're fortunate to have John Mearsheimer and Rana Miller with us, the two distinguished scholars who bring different perspectives on those questions. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage, along with our moderator for this evening, our council's present CEO, Leslie Vinjamuri. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. And Pin, thank you. That was wonderful. Happy birthday 1 week later. Pin co-hosted a wonderful gala just last week, the China Chamber of Commerce. And one thing that really stood out to me from the many speeches that we listened to was the comment that people said, be sure to differentiate between China and the Chinese people, between America and the American people. It's obviously not always easy to do, but it was, for me, one of the take-home messages from what was a tremendously fabulous and interesting gala. I am very honored to be able to chair this panel. I would say welcome and to welcome Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, but really he's the one who is actually from Chicago properly, and I am quite new to the city still. I've been here 4 months. But nonetheless, it's tremendous to be able to welcome you back to the council. Professor John Mearsheimer and Professor Rana Meter. Rana, of course, has spent much of his career at Oxford University, and just a few years ago traveled across the pond and is now at the Harvard Kennedy School. Two very different scholars, different generations, I think, safe to say. An international relations scholar, a realist scholar, one of the most famous in the world, in John Mearsheimer, who I had the pleasure of following and listening to over many years as a graduate student, and obviously throughout coming up to 8 books, many dinners, and I would say of John, one of the very best mentors in the world of graduate students, takes teaching incredibly seriously. We know you for your work, for your controversial views, for your rigorous thinking, but I think those of us in the academy know you as somebody who really takes people incredibly seriously. So thank you for that. Rana Meter, I've known you for a very long time. We lived in London and Oxford, well, in the UK together, participated in many projects at Chatham House and elsewhere together. So it's great to have you here in Chicago. You are the St. Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'll mention just one of your books and one of John's, too many books amongst the two of you to mention all of them. China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism and Forgotten Ally. And I guess, John, I have to mention, of all the books, we still have to go back to The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. The title in and of itself gives us a sense of your perspective on the structural realities of international relations. So, as Pin told us, we're here today to talk about the most important relationship in the world in the current moment and for the foreseeable future, that between the United States and China. And by important, I mean the most consequential relationship when it comes to structuring much of what will take place across the globe, the future of stability, prosperity, and potentially any other number of things. But I think it is universally agreed by the major powers, certainly by the United States and the Chinese, that is the case. That leaves open all sorts of questions about what follows from that, how to manage the relationship, how to keep it on the tracks, whether there should be and can be guardrails, whether, President Biden was, of course, determined to have cooperation and competition. Many people thought that was logically inconsistent. And I think for the last several months, we've been trying to work out where exactly the Trump administration is on its approach and policy towards China. But let me turn to you, Rana. You're a scholar, a historian, a scholar of China. Tell us your understanding, your perspective, your interpretation of how China sees its role in the global system, how China sees and perceives the United States and conceives of its optimal strategy for managing this very difficult relationship.
Thank you, Leslie. And before I answer that question, could I also add my own thanks? It's a huge pleasure to be here today in Chicago with two old friends, old in the sense of long-standing, not in the sense of anything. We all still have our own teeth, or so I believe. Leslie is, of course, a wonderful friend and colleague from London days, and we both, I guess, translated ourselves across to America recently and exploring new possibilities here. And John, of course, has been famous for a lot longer than I have known him, but it's been a pleasure also to engage with him as well. Also, I have to say thank you for all of you for coming this evening to join us for this conversation. I think we're going to bring in the audience a little later on. I have to confess that it's nearly 20 years since I've been here in Chicago, so that's a great pleasure as well. I think when I first arrived, I was still inspired by many of you. One or two of you may be old enough here, as I can see in the audience, to remember that classic movie from the 80s, The Untouchables, about the mafia here in Chicago, where the character of Elliot Ness makes his way down the steps of Union Station while firing a revolver to get away. Whereas I arrived at O'Hare Airport and took an Uber to the hotel. So it was slightly less exciting, but nonetheless pleasant to do that. I think it is right that we start this evening's conversation in China itself, and in terms of thinking about how things look from not just Beijing in terms of the policy institutes and the wider ecology, you might say, of policymaking. It could be academics, think tanks, of course, members of the Chinese Communist Party as part of that, but also the wider society. I think it's fair to say that we often underestimate in the West how much there is a wider conversation about foreign affairs, including on social media, that feeds into decisions that are made. But in the interests of economy of time, I'm just going to give one example of something that caught my attention a little while ago, which I think in some ways speaks to worldviews and how they might sit in a very different sort of place from what we'd expect from our American or Western perspective. And this is a television show. Now, I don't know how many, I've just betrayed my knowledge of old American films. I don't know how many people here are great aficionados of Hunan Province TV. But I have to say it's actually one of the most popular TV stations in China. And about 2 years ago, in 2023, they broadcast a 5-part TV show called When Marx Met Confucius. Now, if you haven't seen this yet, not now, but after you've finished, get your phones out. After we finish, get your phones out and have a quick trawl, because you have a treat in store for you. 2 actors placed basically behind a projected, in front of a projected moon in the background. Each of the actors, I have to say, wearing a blatantly fake beard, one of them representing Karl Marx, one of them representing Confucius. And they have a debate over 5 episodes about whether or not it is feasible for a Western-derived framework like Marxism to be relevant for the country that's produced Confucius and his thinking. And I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but let's just say that Xi Jinping thought plays quite a large part in episode 5, where they bring everything together. But I will give you just one quote from one of the episodes where the Karl Marx character says, sort of stroking his beard slightly, "You know, Confucius, I always did feel a little bit Chinese." The reason that I bring this TV show up is that in some ways, and obviously in a rather sort of pop culture way, brings up a much wider set of theoretical and political dilemmas, which I think are really driving a lot of very interesting conversations in China right now about global affairs. Because actually, if you think about those 2 particular threads, strands of thinking, Confucian thinking in terms of China's longer philosophical traditions that go way, way back, possibly even before you were appointed at Chicago, John, or only just so perhaps, or also, of course, the introduction in the 20th century of the Marxist tradition, which is then combined with Leninism in terms of a highly Soviet-inspired modern system of disruptive change. And both of these are relevant today. On the one hand, Xi Jinping talks a great deal about what he calls fine traditional Chinese culture, which is essentially a reference to that Confucian tradition. And we hear in policy circles terms such as 天下, often translated as sort of the empire or the kind of, wider environment with, in the pre-Westphalian world where you don't necessarily operate according to modern nation states, and whether that has relevance today. You also hear a great deal about the way in which a Marxist worldview, one that derives from that kind of Hegelian idea, or we're in Chicago, we could talk about Hegel, right? I'm sure Leo Strauss would have been happy to be here had he been with us. But the idea of different forces coming up against each other, coming to some sort of thesis, and then making their way through further struggle. And the term struggle is also one that you'll hear Xi Jinping and other senior politicians in China use when they're speaking to a home audience in those Marxist terms. Now, the point is that Confucianism, as a philosophy of harmony, hierarchy, and order, and Marxist-Leninism, essentially as a revolutionary thesis of smashing things and changing them fundamentally, are not obviously very compatible with each other. But I think the fact that both of these wider elements, in terms of international order, China thinking about where it sees institutions, the United Nations, the WTO, international norms when it comes to everything from the internet to AI to telecoms, can draw from both of those traditions, both the idea that something new is emerging, as with AI, and that new norms and standards are needed, but also in a time where the United States, rightly or wrongly, has been regarded now as a place that is rejecting much of the old order and making it new, also portraying China as a place that is in some ways a guardian or a preserver of that older order, well, at least from 1945 onwards, while, of course, at the same time, making it clear that many aspects of that order, for instance, on civil liberties and human rights, are not compatible with Beijing's current worldview. All of this is part of the debate. The final thing I'll add, and this might be a very nice handover to John, who I know has so many, fascinating views and research that he's done on this sort of subject. I would say that Confucianism, Marxism, Leninism, the impact of modern history, all of these are philosophical factors in shaping China's worldview on order. But the one thing that has retreated really strongly and was always a secondary rather than a primary thread is the liberal idea. The idea of the liberal world order, what the great scholar, you probably had him here, John Eichenberry, called the liberal Leviathan that was the United States for much of the mid-20th century. That is not an idea that either China's geopolitical thinkers have necessarily accepted and certainly don't see as part of the order that's emerging in the 2010s and 2020s as Xi Jinping observes that we are going through changes that have not been seen for 100 years, that is, since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917.
Let me ask you one more quick question before I turn it over to John with a question first. In China's view, is there space for the United States to be a great power in the Indo-Pacific? Yes or no?
For now. That's 2 words. I think that for now, I think that the overall view is that it's neither feasible nor likely that the United States will leave the Asia-Pacific space in the near future, by which I mean the 2010s, 2020s. But I think that there are a lot of people in China who are very interested in the current Washington-based debate about whether or not a hemispheric division of global order might be something that emerges in the near future. And you do hear talk about 新盟逻辑, the new Monroe Doctrine. In other words, people in Beijing who think that actually that aspect of traditional US control in the Western Hemisphere may have people who want to put it forward. But I would not say that's the mainstream now. On the other hand, it is in the discourse.
So, John, we spend a lot of time in the think tank, policy world, public space, talking about, what is Trump's policy towards China? What is Biden's policy towards China? What was Bob Zoellick thinking with his responsible stakeholder thesis? Debating different U.S. approaches over the past few decades towards managing the China challenge, so to speak. Are we focused on the wrong thing? What is U.S., how do you conceive of America's strategy towards China? And is the conflict, the tension basically inevitable? I'm leading you towards how we think of you, a structural realist that sees competition and conflict as somewhat inevitable.
Let me just say, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be up here on the stage with 2 of my favorite intellectuals on the planet. It's very interesting to me to listen to Rana talk about the Chinese in terms of Confucianism and Marxism, and then bringing in liberalism, because what he left out was realism. And from my perspective, the Chinese are the most realist people on the planet. When I go to China, I often start my talks by saying, it's good to be back among my people. Now, you want to understand that I don't speak 1 word of Chinese. I feel like a complete alien from a cultural point of view when I'm in China. But in terms of how they think about the world, how they think about international politics, I believe that they are realists to the core. And that says a lot about what I'm going to tell you regarding American policy. I think the U.S.-Chinese relationship today is a realist enterprise. But talking about the Americans, it wasn't always that way. Cold War ends, and the United States is the unipole. And the unipolar moment, where we are by definition the only great power on the planet, runs, in my opinion, from roughly 1992, that's the year after the Soviet Union disintegrates, up until about 2017, where we go from unipolarity to multipolarity. But let's just focus on the unipolar moment, which many of you remember very well, I'm sure. When we were Godzilla, we pursued a policy of engagement towards China. This was a policy that was designed to help China grow economically. And we thought that China would become much more prosperous, and that was a good thing. And the reason was we were going to embed China in all of these international institutions like the WTO, and they would become, in Robert Zoellick's terminology, a responsible stakeholder. Furthermore, as China got wealthier, as it got integrated into these international institutions, it would follow in the path of the Asian tigers, and it would become a liberal democracy. So China would be a liberal democracy. It would be hooked on economic interdependence because it was integrated into the world economy, and it would be a responsible stakeholder because it was in all these international institutions. 2017, the world becomes multipolar, and the United States is still the most powerful state on the planet. China becomes a peer competitor. It's number 2. Russia is a distant third. For all of you in the audience who believe Russia is a serious threat to Europe and it's a serious threat to the United States, this is poppycock. Russia is a weak, great power. China is a completely different story. China is the peer competitor to the United States. And more importantly, it could possibly be a regional hegemon. Rana was getting at this at the end of his comments in response to his second question from Leslie. The idea that China might dominate East Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere is a real possibility. So what happens when we go from unipolarity to multipolarity and the peer competitor is China? We go from engagement to containment. And it's Trump in 2016 who explicitly runs against engagement during the campaign. And as soon as he moves into the White House in 2017, he jettisons engagement and he pursues containment. Joe Biden, as you know, replaces Trump in the White House in January 2021. Biden had been a huge proponent of engagement when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and when he was vice president. So you might think that what he would do is go back to engagement. He does not go back to engagement. He pursues containment. And in fact, if anything, he doubles down on Trump's policy of containment. And the reason for this is that China is really powerful. This is no longer the period before 2017, the unipolar moment, where China was not a great power. It's now a great power. So what we are doing now is we are bent on containing China. And our policy has changed in a very important way. I want to make one more point, and then I'll turn it back over to Leslie. It's very important to understand that from the time we got our independence in 1783, up until about 2017, 1783 to 2017, Europe was the most important area of the world to the United States. Despite the fact that we got attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, we had a Europe first policy in World War II. And during the Cold War, when we used to run war games, the Central Front in Europe would become the centerpiece of the conflict. And we would swing military assets out of East Asia to Europe because Europe was so important. That's no longer the case. The most important area of the world today is East Asia. And we talk about pivot to Asia. You remember in 2011, Hillary Clinton coined the term pivot to Asia. Well, as you all know, when you pivot to someplace, you pivot away from another place. The place we want to pivot away from, and this is the place Trump wants to pivot away from, is Europe, because Europe's just not that important anymore. Because as I told you, Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's not China today. Russia's the weakest of the three great powers. It's not a potential regional hegemon. China is. So we now have our gun sights on China. We're bent on containing China. We're bent on making sure that China does not dominate East Asia. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. It had 4 of them in the 20th century: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. You want to understand the United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The Chinese, of course, understand this full well. They understand full well that we have our gun sights on them. And that, in essence, is what's driving this competition.
Okay, so,
But apart from that,
but apart from that, okay, so let me push you a little bit on all of this, right? Because, assuming that you're right? So you have different perspectives, but there's still this world in Washington, and we believe in Chicago and across Europe and across, frankly, the rest of the world that still has to decide, what do you do, right? And so there's a big question here about, yes, okay, so there is clear conflict, there's clear competition. There are many people that believe China's winning the competition in certain domains, artificial intelligence being one, people disagree. But there is a very serious debate about what you do with this. How do you moderate? Should you aim to moderate the competition? Should you aim for more student exchanges? We know that these have, radically dropped off since the COVID pandemic. American students are not going to China. Should you invest in cooperation on questions of climate, on technology, on trade, or do you just sort of accept that you're in this very tough and difficult space? In other words, if you sort of took yourself away from the University of Chicago and put yourself on the National Security Council or somewhere where you actually have to decide, how do you make this as good as it can be for the United States, for the U.S., for America's allies and partners, for, the broader goals of stability, peace, prosperity, humanity, et cetera? What would you do? I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to come to you on this.
You want to start with me?
Yeah. So would you do trust building, confidence building, exchanges, or is containment, you say containment is the strategy. What is that, is that the right strategy, and what should it look like? Surely there's sort of some space for choices within this broad bucket of containment.
I'll give you a summary view of how I think about this. First of all, if I'm China, I want to dominate Asia. I want to be a regional hegemon. We are a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. It's the most secure position you can have in international politics. So if I'm the national security advisor in Beijing, I tell Xi Jinping, we want to be by far the most powerful state in Asia. We want to dominate all of our neighbors. And furthermore, we want to first push the United States beyond the first island chain. Then we want to push them beyond the second island chain. This is the Monroe Doctrine for the Chinese. That's the smart thing for them to do. I believe they understand it, and I believe they will push in that direction. Now, going to the United States has a deep-seated interest in making sure China does not dominate East Asia. And we will pursue a containment policy. The real danger is that we will go beyond containment. First of all, you want to understand, it's very hard for most Americans to understand this. The United States is a ruthless great power. There are a few great powers in the history of the world that are as ruthless as the United States. And the United States during the Cold War, it took me a long time to learn this, but the United States did not pursue a simple containment strategy. We pursued a rollback strategy. We wanted to roll back the Soviets. We wanted to wreck the Soviet Union from the start of the Cold War until the end of the Cold War, because that's the way we operate. It's the way all great powers operate. I think the danger is today that we will go beyond containment and pursue an aggressive rollback strategy, try to weaken China, and that will lead to unending trouble. So if I were in the White House, which of course will never happen, I would be in favor of firmly pursuing a containment strategy, but just a containment strategy and staying away from rollback.
Sorry, before we come to you, Rana, can you just give us very concretely what a rollback strategy might look like were the U.S. to pursue it? If it overstepped the containment strategy, and what does that look like? What does rollback
let's just
look like?
say that China had good relations with a country like Vietnam or some other country in the region, and we went to great lengths to destroy that relationship. Or we tried to sow internal dissension inside of China, much the way we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. You understand that? We tried to cause trouble in Ukraine during the Cold War for the Soviet Union. We could do something with the Uyghurs. We could do something with Tibet. There may be other places too. But, great powers get very creative in thinking about ways to cause trouble for their adversaries. And what I'm saying to you is I think we have to be extremely careful here.
Okay, we'll come on to Taiwan later, but Rana, your sense of, respond to John, Professor Mearsheimer.
I certainly will. Well, first of all, just to pick up, sort of sneak in a response to your first point, John, I did leave out realism. You're absolutely right. And the reason I'm going to stick to that decision and push back is that stories, and if I were an IR person, I'd be a constructivist because I believe in stories. But actually, that's the reason I'm a historian and not a social scientist. I think that people do need stories to make sense of who they are in the world and what they do. Liberalism is a story. You might argue that it's a story that has had many failures, but it's been a very convincing one for many people. MAGA is a story. It's one that's emerging right now. We don't know where it's going to go, but it definitely has a whole narrative element around it. And actually, the revolutionary tradition of the Chinese Communist Party, of course, it has changed, beyond recognition in so many ways in the party of the 2010s and 2020s with this huge superpower. But it's still the same party that actively seeks to find its point of origin in events that took place out in Chinese countryside in the 1920s and 1930s, when people joined the revolution, not because they were realists, they were very unrealistic in many ways. There were all sorts of people out there, the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek, who were there to try and gun them down. They joined that revolution, rightly or wrongly, for reasons that had to do with ideas, not with the maximum calculation of power. And many of those ideas still, I think, shape who people think they are in the world today. So I would say on those terms, I'm going to stick to the idea that actually ideas matter, and even Confucianism and Marxism might be part of that for the Chinese as well. But in terms of getting to the question of where it is that we might be in a competition, a contest, something which we could put perhaps, flesh on the bones of the idea of where there's going to be a competition. Containment, that's a word that John's going to own, and he'll push back down on it. But what I would say is that of all the areas we could talk about, let's just take three. And they do conveniently begin with T, each of them. And the one of them you mentioned already, we'll get to that in a moment. But the three T's that I think are at the heart of where the US and, the Western world, if you want to call it that, you include Japan and others in that, are looking to find the next phase of that competition with China, sit in the world of trade and tariffs. There's actually two T's in one, but we'll count them as one and a half. The second is the world of technology. And the third is on the Taiwan question. Very briefly, but on each of those, because I think they all illustrate the question about realism and stories and ideas and where you have to go. The first one on trade and tariffs. I think there is no doubt that the very sudden shift in global trade policy that the United States has implemented in the last 6 or 7 months, not just on China, but on the rest of the world, has really overthrown something that for a very long time was assumed to be the core of US thinking, which is around the idea of free trade as a good in its own right. Now, everyone in this room and certainly on this panel knows that the US hasn't necessarily been practicing if it ever practiced real free trade. That began to fade around the same time as people like Hillary Clinton decided that actually the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was in the air 10, 15 years ago probably wasn't going to work out. But nonetheless, the very explicit pushback against that kind of trade regime does give China the opportunity, as it's doing now, to argue that it is really the bringer of true free trade to the wider world. And it would point to examples like RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which contains within Asia something like 12 or 13 countries, many of which have really bad diplomatic relations with China, like Australia, but nonetheless are included in its broad, not necessarily high level, but nonetheless relatively advanced free trade agreement in that area. So that's advantage China on that front, unless you can see an alternative argument that comes through these new bilateral deals. The second one is technology. This is something where, again, if we're thinking about the long-term effects, is a product of both, as people have said, observed in the US, the difficulty in being able to contain your technological ecology to prevent people learning, borrowing, stealing, whatever it might be. But it shouldn't be underestimated that China has, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, been spending something like 2.5% of its GDP on research and development. All of those universities and research institutes in China didn't come out of nowhere. All the EV factories, all of the concentration in a whole variety of areas in AI, in biotech, in quantum computing. Of course, there are all sorts of, let's be honest about it, dubious things about the way in which China has taken some of that information. But at the same time, ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the huge amount of investment and time that China has taken in R&D and development, is ignoring the main question. In other words, we should have started in the Western world 20 years ago. But right now, the reason that so much of the world is taking 5G from China is that there's no major American competitor that can actually provide the kind of product that Huawei or ZTE can do, and the couple of Europeans that exist are much smaller. The final one, I'll only mention it briefly because it's a topic in itself, but the question which is becoming more and more urgent of what is the status of Taiwan? I say this because anyone who's kept an eye on the headlines, and I suspect that this audience keeps a very close eye on them, will see there's been huge spats between Chinese diplomats and Japanese government in the last 2 or 3 days over the question of the new Prime Minister, Mrs. Takeichi, saying that Japan believes that defense and preservation of Taiwan's current status is a core national interest for Japan. This has led to huge pushback, pushback is a very polite word, huge kind of rage and outrage in China, including some very, very intemperate language about people's heads being cut off. That tweet, by the way, has now been removed from the Chinese consul's X feed, I believe. But Taiwan is not going to go away as a question, and it will no doubt shape, I think, a great deal of the geopolitics of the region in the decade to come.
John, your perspective on Taiwan, both understanding the situation, but if you, again, had to put yourself in the White House, what would you be advising the U.S. government to do with respect to its Taiwan policy? Strategic ambiguity or make a change?
Well, just let me say, I think that Taiwan is an extremely dangerous flashpoint. The Chinese, as Rana's comments make clear, consider Taiwan to be sacred territory, and any explicit change in our policy is going to cause huge amounts of trouble, as the Japanese just found out. I would note, by the way, that Joe Biden on 4 occasions said that the United States would defend Taiwan, but he walked it back each time. But I think the fact he said it sent a clear signal to the Chinese. My view on Taiwan is that the Chinese are not going to attack it anytime soon. And I think it's too tough a military task. An amphibious assault across the Taiwan Strait would be an extremely difficult military operation under any circumstances. But given that the Chinese military has not fought a war since 1979, this is not a finely tuned military force. Furthermore, I think with the coming of drones, getting across the Taiwan Strait is going to be remarkably difficult. Furthermore, I think the Chinese understand the Americans, the Japanese, and probably the Australians will fight with Taiwan, that the United States will not stand aside, nor will the Japanese. And that will make it a really wicked fight. On top of all that, the Chinese have all sorts of domestic, economic, and political problems at home that I think would discourage them from attacking Taiwan. So I don't think it's likely that there will be a conflict over Taiwan anytime soon.
So let me ask you the question about all the other countries that we are told feel a bit squeezed in between these, two behemoths, that they may have to choose sides. Southeast Asia, we've heard that since Trump's Liberation Day that they've kind of moved a bit closer to China. Maybe it's clearly, I'm sure, a more complicated story than that. But that across a number of countries, even those that might wish to lean in towards the United States, that China has a lot more to offer financially in terms of investments and any other number of offers. But that actually, if you look at not only emerging powers, the sort of more, weighty middle powers, but also the small countries, they prefer to have some distance from this competition, not to be forced into either camp. Tell me your reaction to that. How do you characterize if you break up the globe, those that are sort of forced to make a choice, if you look at Latin America and Southeast Asia, in particular areas where China has a big footprint, how is the US faring? How is that competition unfolding?
I'd say there are two things emerging in the context of, as you said, Leslie, the unwillingness to be squeezed, the willingness to, have the chance to play on both sides and see where things go. It's very notable. I mean, just one example, if you go to Singapore, for instance, I think many people will have been there. You can sort of be driving along, see a huge Microsoft office, and then you turn around the corner and there's a massive office for ByteDance, one of the biggest Chinese software companies. And I asked a senior Singaporean, official about how long they could keep in both of those tech ecologies, and just said, as long as possible, which is fair enough, I think. I think, though, that there are two places or two elements where what people say and what they mean are different. I'll just explain what I mean by that. The first is that you will hear lots of leaders in Southeast Asia in particular saying, don't make us choose between the two. We need China for trade, we need the market, we need FDI, all these sorts of things. But at the same time, we don't want to get caught up in we don't want to become the subject of dominance by other powers. But when they say dominance by other powers, they do really mean China. The United States has on occasion shown signs of thinking about withdrawing from the region. When Rodrigo Duterte was president of the Philippines, he made a really big deal of getting closer to China and saying it's time for the Americans to pack their bags and go home. And at one point during that negotiation, the Americans said, well, okay then, and began actually to sort of talk about ending the SOFA, the State of Forces Agreement that they have with the Philippines, at which point the Duterte administration said, oh, hang on. And of course, ever since then, actually, the relationship between the US and the Philippines has been much stronger. Nobody in Southeast Asia thinks it's possible to remove China from the equation. Of course they don't. But they also know that the United States is really the only power that can provide a counterweight to Chinese military and naval power in the region. And they do not wish to be in a position where China is the only operator of security in the region, because the security offer is not popular, even though they do want to have access to trade. The flip side of that, which is, I think, more relevant to the last 6 to 7 months, is that the United States has clearly started becoming, perhaps in John's terms, more realist about what it wants to do. It's saying, well, look, we provide all of these public goods in common for you in terms of security in the region, and people either need to pay up more, or they have to explain why this is good for the United States to be there as well. Leading again one Singaporean politician to say rather dryly that we used to think of the US, the phrasing was, I think, something like, we used to think of the US as a good friend, and now we think of them as the landlord who are kind of banging on the door looking for rent. But I think that it's an interesting analogy, because the point about your landlord is that you may not love her or him, but if you don't want to be homeless, you pay the rent anyway. And if it's a choice at the moment in terms of the security proposition in the region between basically stumping up more for the US to stay in the region, or letting China essentially, control the security environment, however much it may be an important trading partner, I think in practice most places in the region will continue to actually say that, yes, on balance, we want the United States to be there in the region as well. It's less of an issue, I think, in places for obvious reasons like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, where there's no immediate geographical link. But I'd say that if you look at the areas of contention there, which involve things like control over platforms for cyber, things like 5G provision, also the question of geoeconomics and the use of loans and so forth, the use of economic power, these are areas where those countries, I think, are still trying to work out how they can seek their own best interest, and not always succeeding. And I'd say that actually, President Trump's bailout for Argentina is quite a good practical example in recent weeks of how the current administration is looking to push back against that kind of Chinese financing.
Is it possible to remain autonomous, John, between these two great powers, or will states have to choose a side?
I think that Rana's answer to you was excellent on that point. And let me just build on what he said, take it from a slightly different perspective. I know the Indonesia case quite well because I know the Indonesian president. Indonesia is very interested in building its economy. It has the 4th largest population in the world, and it could become a major power if it grows its economy in a serious way. And the previous president and the present president are committed to doing that. they all fully understand that to grow the Indonesian economy, you have to trade extensively with China. China is of enormous importance economically for countries in the region, Singapore, Indonesia, you name it. At the same time, there's a security issue here. You want to remember that China is not just interested in Taiwan. It's not just interested in the East China Sea. It basically believes that the South China Sea is a giant Chinese lake. And that has consequences for countries like the Philippines and countries like Indonesia. So from a security point of view, there's a powerful imperative for the Indonesians, the Singaporeans, as Rana was saying, to side with the United States. But there are two problems there. One is if you side with the United States on the security front, you'll enrage the Chinese, and that may hurt you economically. The second thing is, can you really trust the United States today, especially given the way President Trump treats allies? It seems that he likes to slap around allies more than he does adversaries. So people are very wary about getting too close to the United States for security reasons, even though they know it's in their vested interest. So they're really caught between a rock and a hard place. And I think it only gets worse with time if the Chinese economy continues to grow at an impressive rate, because that means their military will become more formidable. And if the United States finds itself pivoting more and more to East Asia, because then the competition in East Asia will become greater, and these countries will be forced to make a choice. If you're Indonesia, you're Singapore, you can't hide. You're right there. Geography is destiny in this particular case. I just want to make one other point very quickly, building on what Rana said. It's very important to understand that the Chinese are not only interested in imitating us in the sense that they want to dominate East Asia, they're building a blue water navy like ours to project power around the globe. If you have a Belt and Road policy where you're projecting economic and political power here, there, and everywhere, it's not going to be long before you build a military that can protect those interests. So they're building this big navy with a lot of power projection capability, like the one we have. And the place I look to where the competition will be wicked is the Middle East, more specifically the Persian Gulf. And you can already see evidence of that in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Comment from you, and then we're going to come straight to the audience.
Just a very quick, I hope counterintuitive, perhaps, come back on John's point, which I think is really well made. If you're the US and you want to persuade Beijing, or at least try, that actually the US presence in Asia is a good thing and should be encouraged, just point out, as I have done actually to at least one senior Beijing policymaker, that one of the almost inevitable results of the removal of the US from the region will be that several powers will develop their own nuclear weapons. South Korea is very likely to do that. Japan, extraordinarily, might think about it. Even Taiwan might begin to think about that issue. If you want nuclear proliferation in the region, then remove the American security umbrella and watch it happen. I think if you're Beijing, you really don't want that to happen.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to come to the audience, and with the help of Anastasia, right back here. First question, right? Yeah, right on your left.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you
If
for
you say
coming.
who you are, that would be great.
I'm about to. My name is Felix Tello. I'm a citizen of Chicago. And thank you for this opportunity. The question I want to have is kind of setting aside the historical perspective that you've given us, as well as the current situation, is I want you to kind of envision 10 years from now and what economic relationship you think we should have with China and actually all of Asia, because we're upside down right now from a trade perspective, right? We have a trade imbalance significantly impacting us. And I think instead of the current strategy of this tariff war that we're having is really about growing our mutual economies in a balanced way. So I'm just wondering what levers you think we would actually push in the next 3 years to form a relationship where we're not so adversarial, but that we're both winning from an economic perspective and so forth.
I'm going to take two at the same time, if that's okay. One right up here in the front row.
Thank you, Leslie, for this heavyweight panel, and both are distinguished scholars. But I only
your
have
name,
one
please.
question. My name is Eric Mao, and I run the Geopolitical Forum. And I can only have one question, right?
Yes.
So the tragedy of great power politics, right? So does that theory, how much does that theory apply to, can be applied to mid-sized and small-sized powers in their security competition, or none of it, or you have to have a new theory for those other powers?
Great, thank you. Was there one woman who had her hand up? I'm going to take one female.
Some over there, one over there.
I agree
And
with
your name,
Ron-
please,
Oh,
your name.
Elise Waxpress. I agree with Rana that stories and ideas have consequences. And I agree that realism is important too. But what happens when you've got an administration that realism is not power realism, but monetary realism? And as we just found out today, we're giving armaments to MBS that will probably end up in the hands of the Chinese. So how is that containment when you've got an administration that only cares about money?
Thank you. Okay, those three, who wants to, you don't have to, you can kind of put them together.
I could talk about trade and maybe
Go
John
ahead.
about great tragedy. I mean, tragedy, great power politics is John's.
Go ahead,
You
John.
have to
You
do
can
that
go
one.
first.
And I'll
Okay,
do
you
trade
can go
after that.
first.
Well, the question from this gentleman here was, how does tragedy of great power politics, my basic theory, apply to major powers, not great powers? How does it apply to minor powers, not great powers? And the truth is that realist theories like mine are designed mainly for great powers. There's no question about that. If you're talking about a major power like Japan today or Germany today, I think the theory actually says quite a bit about their behavior. Once you start talking about minor powers like Luxembourg, Belgium, Switzerland, it doesn't say a whole heck of a lot because those states don't have much power. Excuse me, and realism is a theory that deals with power politics, okay? With regard to the young woman over here's question about basically what the Trump administration is doing today and whether it's realism or not. I think the Trump administration is sui generis. It's very hard to figure out, for me, exactly what they're doing. Sometimes they do things that look very realist. Other times they do things that look very foolish. I mentioned before that President Trump tends to slap around allies and treat them in a very transactional way. I think this is foolish in the extreme. Putting together a balancing coalition in Asia because of the geographic distance among all of the states that are going to be in that balancing coalition is a really tricky task. And the last thing you want to do is slap your allies around. You want to work carefully with them. And he doesn't do that. I was no fan of the Biden administration, but one thing that President Biden did well was he treated allies with respect. And I think the balancing coalition that he was putting in place was more successful than the one that Trump is putting in place. Final point I would make to you is you always want to remember that military power is based on an economic foundation. Economic might really matters. The reason that China is so powerful today is not because it all of a sudden grew its military. It's so powerful today because its economy grew by leaps and bounds from the early 1990s up to the present, and especially after it joined the WTO in 2001. So you want to make sure, whether you're China, the United States, Russia, that you have a really powerful economy because that's what you can use to build military forces.
Rana.
All that talk about the economic base, maybe we should get you onto Marxism after all, John. I think that's a nice segue, not Marxism, but economics, to get to the question about trade. So much you could say, so let me just say something brief. Project forward, you said 10 years. Indulge me, make it 15. In the year 2040, in the top 10 most populous countries in the world, number one actually will be India, already is, and it'll be even more so by that stage because of China's one-child policy kicking in with a reducing population size. But China will still be huge at that point. It'll be number two. But entering the kind of hit parade of populations, we will see Indonesia. You just mentioned, John, it will be probably third or fourth most populous world. Nigeria, Pakistan, Democratic Republic of Congo actually is currently scheduled to be in that list. Japan, for instance, will drop out in terms of top 10 population. So start thinking, if we are still talking about the Western world and the Asia Pacific and the kind of broad sense of the economic dynamo of the world, thinking where it should go next, think about what those emerging larger and middle class populations are going to want to trade on. One thing they're going to want is huge amounts of energy because AI is going to be in everything in a few years' time. And as I think you already know by now, we all know this, AI is very hungry for power. That means lots of green energy. And this is one area where the United States at the moment is making, I think, frankly, a very non-realist move. Being on top of both fossil fuel transition and the new green tech was something the previous administration did want to do, and which China is doing, gangbusters. The current administration has turned away from green tech. It's removed subsidies. It's removed the capacity to sell it elsewhere. But it's what places that are vulnerable to climate change, like Pakistan, like Bangladesh, like Indonesia, want and need. So thinking about that question of how AI, energy, and growing populations create economic opportunities that have to be realistic about climate change and also take account of the reality of goods produced in the Western world, high tech, high quality, that are still going to be in demand. That's where the answer is going to come from.
Please.
Just a word on this, and the gentleman's question about thinking 10 or 15 years out. Think about the period before World War I with regard to trade, the period during the Cold War, and then think about the period today. Before World War I, there was a huge amount of economic intercourse, economic cooperation in Europe. At the same time, there was an intense security competition between the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. And you had, nevertheless, World War I in 1914, but you still had all this economic intercourse. Go to the Cold War. There was very little economic intercourse between the Soviet-led order on one side of the Iron Curtain and the U.S.-led order on the other side of the Iron Curtain. A fundamentally different situation than existed before World War I. The situation we have today is analogous to the situation that existed before World War I, with one major caveat. You have today extensive trade between China and its neighbors, to include countries like Japan, South Korea, so forth and so on, between China and the United States. And that trade is going to continue. We're going to continue to live in an economically interdependent world. The one difference is you have this competition over cutting-edge technologies, which is a really intense and wicked competition. You didn't have that before World War I. So I think when you look at the economic realm, you're going to see a huge amount of cooperation, except for the realm of cutting-edge technologies, where you're going to see much competition.
Going to come right back out for one more round. We'll take a couple. Female right in the middle, on your left, Anastasia. You say who you are.
My name is Veronica Passarelli. I work for Northwestern University, and one of the big things we're seeing now is a lot of lack of cooperation with foreign researchers, particularly from China. We had to do a whole training on it, actually. And you're also seeing a lot of brain drain now with, pro-ICE mentality, anti-immigration. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and if you think that's a threat to the U.S.
Thank you. Right here on the, I'll let you choose, Anastasia. You know our audience very well. Thank you.
So my name is Maxwell Fauché, and this is a question primarily addressed to Professor Mearsheimer. And this is involving the aforementioned wicked conflict in the flashpoint underneath with Taiwan. And this is for, as amateur as this might unintentionally sound, in the event of a military confrontation, is if there will be any chance of kinetic attacks on mainland Chinese territory or on U.S. military assets throughout the Pacific. Since I have seen through my own independent research, that seems to be a much more very taboo sort of train of thought. More so would be the conflict being much more focused on the actual Taiwan Strait itself as the battleground, the Spratly Islands alongside with it.
Thank you. And then just this final one by the gentleman behind you, and then we'll come back to the panel for last final answers. Sorry to everybody else who wanted to ask a question.
Thank you. So my name is Pat Blanford. Question is basically about the AI race. So several years ago in this very room, there was an incredible futurist named Amy Webb who wrote a fantastic book called The Big Nine about the 9 companies that essentially had all the AI talent in the world. 6 of them were in the US, 3 were in China. Clearly the US was ahead of the game, but one of the things that struck me was how forward-thinking the Chinese were. And in that book, she talked about how everybody in primary school in China was being schooled in AI, and it was a part of their strategic mission. And so I'm just curious on your views on, the 2 approaches on AI.
Thank you. Rana, I'm going to let you go first.
Okay, well, in that case, let me come straight back on the question on AI, unless John's dying to answer that one, because I think you've got one directed at you. There is no doubt that both the United States and China are pushing huge amounts of resources into developing AI, and Europe ought to be, but isn't doing nearly enough at the moment. And we'll see where the other places come from. There are also other more niche but significant actors, the UK, Israel. To be fair, actually, France actually is doing a fair bit. But characterizing it as a race, I think, may paper over some significant differences which are worth noting. So the first one is that look at what China is doing with the AI that it's developing. Essentially, a large part of it is trying to get its LLMs, its large language models, to become as effective as possible and essentially put more and more resources into them. There is far less discussion, as far as I can tell, in China of one of the big issues that's driving a lot of what's happening in Silicon Valley, which is the quest for AGI, artificial general intelligence. It's not that that isn't relevant to China, as far as I can tell, but it's not at the core of the enterprise. That's partly, or significantly actually, because in China, the big tech majors, although they have huge amounts of leeway for research and experimentation, they have stock market valuations, they have a lot of resources, a lot of labs, a lot of well-trained STEM graduates coming out of Chinese universities, they don't have freedom in terms of what their overall goals should be. That's quite heavily directed by the state. I would hesitate to say that we're getting to a situation in the US where it's the tech bros who are telling the government what to do, but on the other hand, it may be a little bit more in that direction than it would be in China. One final note on that, which has to do with finance, because that's come up a couple of times as well. Right now, there are a lot of people who might say, I couldn't possibly comment, but you might say that we're in the middle of potentially a stock market boom when it comes to AI, and that this might lead to a bubble bursting. That is not, as far as we can tell at the moment, relevant in China. And one of the reasons is not because there aren't huge pools of capital being put into AI enterprises, but because China's equivalent of the Security Exchange Commission, the people who basically regulate the stock market, are very, very risk averse at the moment in terms of worrying about those booms. They had a massive property boom, as people will know, a few years ago. It didn't go so well. I think the enthusiasm in China for having another boom in an even more speculative area, at least, when a house builder goes bankrupt, the house is still there. You can do something about it. AI that goes woof will, produce almost nothing. So I think understanding the difference in terms of what the race is about for both sides is going to become more important over time, and we should concentrate on that. Maybe here at the Chicago Council, in fact, Leslie.
Undoubtedly. John, please.
Yeah, I want to talk very quickly on all 3 points. Just with regard to the gentleman who raised the point about hitting the Chinese mainland in a war over Taiwan, I thought initially that if a war broke out over Taiwan, we would go to great lengths not to hit the Chinese mainland. All my conversations with people in the Defense Department and in the national security establishment tells me we will pound the Chinese mainland in a war over Taiwan, which scares the living bejesus out of me. And just to add one dimension to that, you want to understand that Chinese nuclear and conventional assets often share the same command and control systems, so that if you go after conventional assets in a war over Taiwan, you come dangerously close to shifting the strategic nuclear balance, because you're not just going after conventional weapons. And there's no sort of parallel with the Chinese hitting the United States, because we're in their backyard, not our backyard. They can hit Guam or other places, American bases, but it's not the same as us hitting the Chinese mainland. This is another dimension to the Taiwan situation that makes it really scary. Just a couple words on immigration. First of all, I think that, driving Chinese students out or not letting Chinese students in, not giving H-1B visas to let Indians come into Silicon Valley is not a smart thing to do. We are in an arms race involving cutting-edge technologies with the Chinese, and native-born Americans don't get degrees in engineering and physics in ways that they used to, and we need all the immigrants that we can get. Another key point about immigration you never want to forget. Basically, the world is depopulating except for Africa and maybe India at the moment. But the Chinese are depopulating, the Russians are depopulating, we're depopulating. Our great ace in the hole over time is that we are an immigrant culture. Virtually all the Americans in the audience here, me included, had distant relatives who came across the pond at one point in time. This is a country that was built on the back of immigrants. Bring them in. And the Chinese and the Russians, they're not immigrant cultures. This is a huge disadvantage for them. So what's going to happen, Trump and the MAGA people notwithstanding, in 5-10 years, we're going to open the sluice gates again and bring in immigration and bring in immigrants. And that is a good thing. My final point just has to do with AI. Just very quickly, you want to understand that the competition in AI is a realist competition. That was the point that I was making to you before. There's not just a military competition here. When you think of containment, you think of military competition. There is a wickedly intense competition in terms of AI. Because if you talk to people in the administration who handle the AI portfolio, they will tell you that the great fear is that in this competition involving AI with the Chinese, there may be a point that one side hits before the other where you have an exponential takeoff, and that leaves the other side way behind and unable to catch up. So this competition, which is mainly an economic competition, because the military dimension is a spin-off of the economic dimension, so they say. But anyway, AI, quantum computing, all these sophisticated technologies, we have to make sure that we beat the Chinese. And by the way, going back to my previous point, we need immigrants for that purpose.
Final comment here from Rana on this, and then we will close.
Well, it's an adaptation of an old saying that saying that our Chinese scientists need to beat your Chinese scientists in that case. I think, we don't necessarily have to think of it as a competition. We can also think of it as one of the ways in which knowledge and ideas spread around the world. The United States, and I'm very proud to, serve in one of its greatest universities. There's the University of Chicago as well, of course, but nonetheless, they wouldn't let me in there. If it were not for the Chinese students and the students from all around the world and from all different backgrounds and classes and all of that, who make an extraordinary mix of people whose learning is important, but whose shared experience is also important, then the United States and its, globally unmatched academy would not be what it is. I think that it is essential that the United States, for its own good, and I speak as a huge fan of this country, because I wouldn't have come to live here, preserves that wonderful asset for exactly the same reasons that John has said, and that certainly includes Chinese students. I think we may have ended up on a note of agreement, John. How worrying.
And on that note, please join me in thanking these two terrific men.